Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of The Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, in the first topic, we'll try to understand that why RBI is not pushing anymore for the de-dollarization of the Indian economy. Then in the second topic, we'll try to understand that what is the negative impact of the fertilizers on the soil's health and what are the steps which shall be taken for soil conservation. Then in your simplified section, we'll be taking up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide the much important value addition and practice questions keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2025. So stay tuned. The explained article today in the Indian Express actually highlights why the Reserve Bank of India is actually pushing for the hedge against the dollar reliance instead of going for the complete de-dollarization of the Indian economy as being envisaged earlier. And we are going to discuss this concept under the theme of your GS3 paper, which is the Indian economy and issues related to the growth of the country as a whole. Now today we are going to actually adopt a different kind of an approach where we are going to try to understand the information which has been provided in another explained article and then try to implement that on the article on de-dollarization. So we'll start today by understanding the basics. The news which actually entails that the foreign exchange reserves of our country has actually reached to $658 billion in the month of November 2024. Thus kind of reversing a 8-week decline which we were witnessing in the foreign exchange reserve. The foreign exchange reserve, which are actually kept by the Reserve Bank of India under the provisions of RBI Act of 1934, has 4 special components. First is any kind of foreign currency asset, such as for example if the RBI is actually holding on the US treasury bills or the government release securities. The second is the various kind of gold reserves. The third is the special drawing rights, which is basically a kind of a claim of currency, the basket of currencies which we have, and that is also kept by the International Monetary Fund. The fourth is the reserve tranche with IMF, where basically the claim of the IMF is generally lesser than the amount which it is holding of the currencies of the different countries. So this basically constitutes the foreign exchange reserves. The more important question is that what is the utility of such foreign exchange reserve? So this basically acts as a kind of cushion to any kind of balance of payment shocks which can be faced by, let's say, any Indian company or the government. So it provides a kind of a hedge against such balance of payment shocks. To understand that, let's take an example of a power corporation denoted by the letter S, where this power corporation is actually going to kind of buy a machinery which is worth $1 billion from the USA. Now for that purpose it will require $1 billion, that is a foreign currency. So RBI says that do not worry the power corporation, we are going to back you up because we have got a reserve of, let's say, $658 billion. So obviously you can take a pie from that. You give us the Indian rupee, we provide you the US dollars, and you pay in the US dollars to the company in the USA. So we have understood the concept of foreign exchange reserves. Keep this in mind that all of this is being denominated in which currency? US dollar. Then comes the second component, and that is the balance of payment. The balance of payment is that, let's say for example, when we are saying that this foreign exchange reserves can get shocked or can have some volatility related to the balance of payment crisis. So what do we mean by balance of payment? The balance of payment has 2 important components. First is the current account and the second is the capital account. The current account basically consists of any kind of trade in the goods, that is merchandise, and that is falls in the category of net visible. So for example, our total export in the merchandise goods was around $441 billion in the fiscal year of 23-24, while our import was around $683 billion, and thus we incurred a merchandise trade deficit of around $242 billion. That means this was the amount which we had to pay extra from our pocket, right? The second is the trade in services and remittances, both of them which falls in the category of net invisibles. So the article suggests that in services we have actually registered a kind of a surplus consistently from the pandemic time period onwards. And a major reason for that is the export of software services, for which we have incurred kind of a profit or kind of a trade of $142 billion in the last fiscal year. There was also increase in the export of financial services, and as per the article today, it has actually been led by the global capability centers. In the transfer payment, we registered remittances as high as $106 billion. Then there are certain components of your capital account. First is the foreign investments which are being made in our country. So let's say, for example, there is a company in US and that actually wants to invest in the Power Corporation, denoted by letter S. That can fall in two categories: the foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment. Foreign direct investment has a kind of a more longer term and duration. They are not only investing in the financial assets like foreign portfolio investors, but also they are kind of bringing their expertise. There can be technology transfers. Long term investments can actually lead to large term capital creation, job creations as well. With these kind of statements, you could have actually solved a prelims PYQ. Then there is foreign portfolio investment, which is obviously a shorter nature in the term, right? The article today suggests that there has been taken place a kind of a balance of payment shock to our foreign exchange reserves. The reason for that being the flight of FPI, which was around $13 billion in the month of October and November itself. Just keep this information in your mind. We know, try to understand the other components of capital account, being the extra commercial borrowings, the non-resident Indian deposits, and the loans which we take from IMF. Now keep this in mind that when we are talking about this FPI, so let's say, for example, we had a total amount of $100, out of which $13 was actually taken out by these FPIs. So let's say now we are left with only $87 in our hand. Now let's say there are several things for which we are highly import dependent, such as, for example, being oil. So as per the OPEC report, we are currently 87% import dependent for our oil needs. So for that also we require what? Foreign exchange currency or US dollar. So the idea is what? That there can take place a time where we can actually, these companies can run short of the dollars to pay for the things which we are buying, such as, for example, remember this huge merchandise trade deficit which we have. This is the case, let's say, for example, so there is less dollar in the market right now. So if there is less dollar in the market, the demand of the dollar is high in comparison to the Indian rupee. So obviously the Indian rupee will do what? It will depreciate. So let's say earlier $1 was equal to 100 rupees. Now because our currency has depreciated in comparison to US dollar, so $1 has now become to $110. Again, imagine the same Power Corporation buying that kind of machinery which it was from US. What will happen now? So earlier it was paying how many rupees per dollar? 100 rupees. Now it has to pay what? 110 rupees. So the import will become costlier. So that will create a kind of a chain. First of all, the import is getting costlier, and for the very same product we are paying much more foreign exchange reserves now. So that can lead to deterioration of our foreign exchange reserves and depreciation of our Indian currency, and this is the time when RBI will have to intervene, just like how it did in the month of October and November as well, where it started infusing the dollar in the market to actually bring the kind of parity between US dollars and Indian rupee. But when RBI is using the dollar from foreign exchange reserves, it is leading to what? The decline of our foreign exchange reserves as well. So when we have understood this kind of mechanism, just have a look here where the article actually argues that it is not much about the FPI outflow which is taking place, which is actually kind of acting as a detrimental to our foreign exchange reserve, but the less amount of foreign direct investments in the recent year. Such as, for example, just see from the 2021 onwards, the foreign direct investment has declined up to $26 billion in the year of fiscal year 23-24. Similarly, just have a quick look here. Just look at the kind of trade deficit which we incurred in the last few years. From that, there was an invisible surplus. So there was a kind of a surplus money which we were getting from the kind of services which we were providing. So let's say that was $218 billion in comparison to the trade deficit of $242 billion. So there was a kind of a current account deficit of $23 billion which was incurred. But at the same time, the capital inflows from FDI and FPI, that was around $86 billion. So the total reserves actually increased by $63 billion, and thus we are in a very sustainable position as per the article today. Now when we have understood all these concepts, a question shall be coming in a student's mind that all these transactions, the foreign exchange reserves, the balance of payment, why all of this is being denominated in US dollar only? because this power corporation can also be, let's say, buying machinery or selling machinery from, let's say, European Union. So why not in euro and why only in dollar? As of today, the US dollar is the world's most widely held reserve currency, amounting to the 59% of the reserve currencies of the world. And it also accounts for $6.6 trillion of daily transactions on the global scale. Even if we talk in the terms of, let's say, for example, oil, despite the efforts of OPEC plus countries or Russia and China to actually devise a kind of an alternative price mechanism, even today, the oil trade is being denominated in which currency? US dollar. What is the reason for such hegemony which is being held by the US dollar as a currency? For that purpose, we will just slightly shift back to a little bit history of the currency. From the 13th century onwards, we see the rise of gold as an accepted currency of trade among the European powers with the trades which is taking place in the Mediterranean Sea or the Arabian Sea. For example, when these Europeans are arriving in our country, they are bringing us what? The bullions, and that is what? Gold and silver. Now, if we refer to the economist, and whose name is B. Aiken Green, he says that the major impetus or the dominance of gold as a currency actually came after its de facto adoption as an official currency by Britain in 1717, and then took place the industrialization in 1750s. Thus, Britain kind of rose as an economic superpower, and other countries also started adopting gold as a currency to trade with Britain and draw capital investments. Then what happens? Then in 1920s, the dollar begins to displace the pound sterling or the currency of Britain as an international reserve currency after the First World War, because the United States emerged as a significant recipient of the wartime gold inflows. Same thing take place in the Second World War as well, where US is supplying a lot of supplies to the Allies, lot of weapons to the Allies during the Second World War, which started on 1st of September 1939. So, by the end of World War II, the US is actually holding 65% of the gold reserves of the world, and that is why it could actually dominate at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the 44 allied countries of the US actually kind of have a meeting to settle down which international currency to adopt. And under its grand area concept, US actually implies that the gold and the world currency is now going to be pegged to the US dollar. So all countries can basically now trade in US dollars, and US is saying that I am going to back your trade with the equal amount of the gold. But by the year of 1970s, it has emerged as a kind of a standard currency of the world, and thus even the backing of the gold was not required, and that's why it was discontinued by the President Nixon in the year of 1971. However, from the 1980s onwards, we actually see a kind of a decline of the demand of dollars, such as, for example, after years of hyperinflation, the US dollar loses 2/3 of its purchasing power. By the year of 2007-8, the global financial crisis takes place, and the investor seeks US dollar, expecting the currency to retain its value. But in 2014, following the annexation of Crimea, the Russia prioritized de-dollarization in response to the Western countries' sanctions which was put against them. Now, such high dependence on the US dollar has, as a reserve currency, has major issues which are being faced by various countries, including our country as well. The first of them is the status as a reserve currency, and that actually empowers the US to kind of regulate the global money supply, which can actually lead to kind of debasement of Indian currency and can actually lead to volatility in our Indian market. For example, let's say if there is any tightening of the repo rate, the rate at which the central bank actually lends to the other banks, the repo rate tightening by US Federal Reserves will lead to what? Less amount of dollar supply in the market. The less amount of dollar supply will mean what? The FDI and FPI in India will actually decline. Thus, can we say that the dollar in our Indian economy has become less? So the demand of dollar will rise. The demand of Indian currency is less in comparison to that. So depreciation of currency, imports will become what? Costlier. That will lead to what? Inflation in our Indian economy. Just now we have solved a prelims PYQ. Second is that because there is such a high demand of dollar because of its perceived stability, in any kind of geopolitical tensions, there takes place a kind of a dollar premium, where for the same amount of dollar there is an additional cost attached to it. So for example, if I'm doing the very same trade in Russian ruble, I will have to pay actually less, but because I'm paying in dollar and it has higher stability, I'm actually paying higher amount. Third is the weaponization of US dollar. So the first two factors actually contribute to what? Use of this US currency to actually kind of intervene in the political affairs of the country. That was very much visible in the Suez crisis which took place in 1956, where Britain and France actually invaded Egypt because of the nationalization of the Suez Canal, but they ultimately had to withdraw. Why? Because US, their currency was actually pegged to the US dollar. So US pressurized them and they had to kind of, take back their armies. So it can also have kind of geopolitical impacts as well. The fourth is the recent global supply chain disruptions which has taken place. As for example, the Russia-Ukraine war that has actually led to the increase in the demand of US dollar, and that is actually detrimental for the import dependent countries like India. And that can lead to the balance of payment crisis as we were discussing. As a country, we have already faced that back in the year of 1991. Then there is a declining trust in the US dollar. So if you refer to the kind of a report which was published by Center for Policy Research, it basically states that currently US has high debt to GDP ratio. For example, the current debt is around 130% to the GDP. As per the IMF projection, it can actually rise to 145% by the year of 2027. There is also a kind of a inflation which is taking place in US economy. So because of this reason, there is a kind of a declining trust. However, if you refer to the Forbes report, it says that no, US dollar is actually defending its role as a global currency. It still has a share of 9.3% in the global trade, 25% in the global GDP, and if you look at the official foreign exchange reserves, that is 59% as we were discussing. So it's not like that it is going anywhere soon. But there are various countries, including our country, which has taken several steps. Such as, for example, the RBI has directed that from now onwards, all the trade which will take place under the Foreign Exchange Management Act of 1999, it will be denominated in Indian rupee only. Then we have completely transitioned away from the dollar based, the London Bank of Exchange rate which used to take place. We have also created a kind of a Vostro accounts with Russia. What is that? So let's say, for example, there is an Indian company denoted by S, and there is a kind of a Russian company denoted by let's say SU. Now these two companies are trading among each other, and earlier they were trading in what? In dollar. Now we are saying that the Indian company will actually open a bank account A in Russia itself, where we will actually deposit our Indian rupee. The bank will actually give us the Russian ruble, and we will be paying to this in the Russian ruble itself. And the bank will hold the Indian currency. So now if this company requires the Indian rupee to purchase something for us, it can just do that. So that is a kind of a mechanism which we have created. Then there is a promotion of rupee payments platform through various international initiatives like SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or your BRICS. We have also signed memorandum of understanding with United Arab Emirates for rupee dirham trade and the national card switches as well. Even if you look at the international level, there are various efforts which are being taken place. For example, China's cross-border interbank payment system, which is facilitating and supporting cross-border RMB businesses. China-Laos local currency settlement, or for example Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia and the various countries has launched Asian payments connectivity. The BRICS countries is actually developing a new global reserve currency and a single payment system as well, which was very recently in the news. But such movement away from the dollar and the adoption of such local currency also has certain persisting issues for our country. The first is what? That the low share of the Indian rupee in the international trade. So what is the share of Indian rupee in the international trade? That is 1.2%. As per the data released by PIB 6 days back, the share which we have in the international trade is 2.11%. This basically reflects what? That a lot of countries are not actually adopting rupee for the trade purposes. So for example, let's say we were trading with Russia through Vostro account. Now Russia actually exports more to India in comparison to its import. So now the Russian banks are holding to the rupees. But what they will use this rupee for? To pay for what? If you are not importing that much from India. And that is why very recently Russia actually asked India to revert back to the dollar-based exchange mechanism. Second is the curious case of Triffin dilemma. Triffin dilemma basically states that now if you are actually, a lot of countries start using our currency as a kind of an international or a kind of a payment mechanism, then we will have to pay or produce more Indian rupee as per the demand. And if we start doing that, that can actually lead to a kind of an inflationary pressure to our market, and this open channel of funds will also make us vulnerable to the various kind of external shocks, such as for example the Russia-Ukraine war. Then there exists a kind of absence of full account convertibility. So for example, let's say you are a foreign investor and you are buying a land in India. So if you want to sell this land overnight and go back to your country, that is not a possibility. There are certain limitations to that. So that basically acts as a kind of a detriment to various kind of investments by countries, banks, investors, etc. in our country, or actually use the rupee as a mechanism. Then, as per the former member of parliament Varun Gandhi, the demonetization actually shook the confidence in Indian currency further, and there is strong rise of Chinese yuan as an alternative, which has actually become the 5th largest mode of payment in the global currency. Then if we look at the US is currently our second largest trading partner after China, and amounting to around 128 billion trade in the year of 2023. We actually incurred 28 billion trade positive with US. So we are actually incurring profit from our US trade, and that is coming in dollar. So what is the impetus to actually shift away from that? So what can be the steps which can actually be taken? What can be the ideal way forward? First is to actually allow the use of rupee outside India for the current account transaction, to actually make other countries start using that. And for that we can also first start signing the currency swap agreements with our neighboring countries in BIMSTEC and SAARC. Then as per Tarapur committee, we shall actually make the rupee freely convertible. So the capital as well as current account convertibility shall be provided by 2050. And we shall actually provide tax incentives to various foreign businesses which are actually using Indian rupee for the trade. So remember all these important concepts and debates revolving around de-dollarization. Try to solve this particular question and we move forward to the next news, where the editorial actually highlights today the negative impact of the fertilizers on the soil health and suggests certain steps that shall be taken for the soil conservation, forming an important component of your GS3 paper under the theme of agriculture and the related issues. Let's first start by understanding the importance of the article, which actually talks about that how there was World Soil Day on 5th of December with the theme of caring for soils, the measures, the monitors and the management of that. It basically states that how the top soil, which is around 3 centimeters in the depth, and it actually creates around 1000 years for the formation. You guys can see the formation of this 3-layer soil, top soil layer containing of organic matter, the parent matter, then the addition of mineral particles and organic matters, and it is responsible for 95% of the food production. The article, however, highlights that the soil in our country is actually becoming deficient in the essential nutrients. If we refer to the UNCCD report, keep this in mind that 30% of the country's area is actually facing soil degradation. So obviously that is going to impact our food security in the future. For that purpose, let's first try to understand the kind of regulation which we have for the fertilizer industry in our country, as the article highlights that how these fertilizers are actually deteriorating the soil health. So first of all, there exists a nutrient-based subsidy scheme, which basically includes what? It includes diammonium phosphate and the muriate of potash. Under this nutrient-based subsidy scheme, the manufacturers or the importers of these fertilizers, they get a per ton subsidy on the basis of the content. The content is what? How much nitrogen it has, phosphorus it has, potassium or sulfur it has. So these are basically what? The macronutrients which are required for the growth of the plant. So if we are saying that there is a per ton subsidy on the basis of content, it basically means that if the fertilizer has more amount of nitrogen content, then it will actually attract less subsidy, because more nitrogen content is actually harmful for the soil. If it has more content of phosphorus and potassium, then it will actually attract more subsidy, because they are actually beneficial for the soil health. Now remember that this nutrient-based subsidy scheme for this DOP and MOP is basically an informal control design, because the government is not setting the price directly. It is basically providing the subsidy on the basis of the content first of all. Then as per the notification released by the Department of Fertilizer in 2023, it basically stated, it kind of introduced a maximum price mechanism, where it said that any such manufacturer or importer of these fertilizers can charge only a maximum amount of profit above the floor profit. Only then you will get the subsidy, otherwise you will not get that. Remember that urea, the most important, the most produced, most used and most imported fertilizer of our country, is the only fertilizer currently which is actually controlled by the government, and thus there is a statutory pricing by the government, where the government says what? Whatever is the cost of production and import, let's say that is 100 rupees. But the actual price which is being paid by the farmer, that is statutory price, let's say that is only rupees 5 per kg. So the difference of this 95 is completely borne by the subsidy which is provided by the government, that is urea subsidy. Also remember that in 2016 there was this 100% neem coated urea which was introduced by the farmer, which can actually lead to the much more easier absorption of the nitrogen content by the plants, which has been now made mandatory for all the domestic producers. Now the article first highlights the kind of a positive role of the fertilizer industry, where it says that how between 2020 to 2023, India actually produced 85 million tons of cereals and provided subsidized food to around 81 crore people under the National Food Security Act 2013, where we are providing kind of subsidized food to 75% of the rural and 50% of the urban population. Then India has also emerged as the largest exporter of the rice in the world consistently for almost 5 years till 2019, and this supply of Indian fertilizers has actually ensured essential nutrients for the plants like nitrogen, phosphate, potash and other micronutrients, thus providing for higher productivity. That we can see that how the food productions has actually consistently increased in the last few years. But then arise the negative impact of this fertilizer industry as well, and let's try to understand that. First is that because of the overuse or misuse of this fertilizer. So when this nutrient based subsidy scheme was actually introduced, the idea was to bring the ideal N is to P is to K ratio, that is 4 is to 2 is to 1. However, just look here that how Punjab has become a classic example where N, P and K balance has gone for a toss. Punjab is using 61% more nitrogen than needed, 89% less K and 8% less P. Similarly, even for the southern state of Telangana, there is overusing the N by 54%, 82% less K and 13% less P. And this misuse, this misbalance ratio is leading to what? First of all, there is soil acidification which is taking place. So try to understand this, that this overuse of fertilizers lead to the production of ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, etc. And that basically leads to a kind of hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions actually decrease the pH level of the soil, thus making the soil acidic. So the nutrient quality obviously declines. It also actually hampers the growth of fungi, bacteria, the various kind of earthworms in the soil, which are actually essential for the soil health and fertility. So the fertility of the soil declines, the crop productivity will decline as well. What will happen to our food security? Second is that it will lead to the depletion of essential nutrients, because for example, with all these fertilizers, we are providing what? The macronutrients. We are not providing the micronutrients or organic matter to the soil. And with this less amount of organic matter present, it will eventually lead to what? The less water retention capacity of the soil. So that will eventually lead to the soil erosion as well. Then because of the excessive use of fertilizers, there starts taking place soil compaction, and this soil compaction basically means that there will start taking place the flakes of salt in the soil. So the density of the soil will actually increase. And with this increasing density, what will happen? So now the root penetration will actually become much more difficult. The water percolation will also become difficult as well. So the underground water table will decline. Obviously, all of this is going to impact what? The fertility and the productivity. Then the today's article suggests that how there is only 37 to 40% kind of fertilizer adoption rate by the plants. All this excess nutrient actually leads to the flow, let's say for example in some water body, and that leads to the accumulation of chemicals there and the issue of eutrophication, leading to the kind of growth of harmful algae blooms. So that will lead to the high amount of biological oxygen demand and chemical oxygen demand. That will impact what? The aquatic life. And this overuse of fertilizer can also, through the process of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, can get into our body because of the contamination of food crops and can impact our health as well. So what, again, let's say for example, just look the kind of the use of fertilizer products which we are doing. Just see the increasing use of urea here, right? In the kinds of terms we are talking here, the diammonium phosphate, the muriate of potash. In comparison to that, just look at the crop yield in response to the fertilizers, how it has actually kind of declined over the years, specifically from the years of Green Revolution, because of these issues which are taking place. And then just look at the increasing fertilizer subsidy. So obviously this increasing fertilizer subsidy is which actually amounted to 4% of our GDP in the budget 2024. That is going to impact what? Our fiscal deficit targets, which we have set for ourselves, that we are going to reduce our fiscal deficit to 4.5% by the year of 2025. So that is also another issue. So what the government's response has been? So first of all, we have launched what? The soil health card scheme, where we are actually assessing the health of soil of the farmer's field. We are providing them a kind of an ideal fertilizer ratio which they shall use, the N is to P is to K ratio under the scheme which was launched in 2015. Then we have launched a kind of a Krishi Sakhi convergence program, where we are actually training 70,000 rural women who will actually act as a guide to the farmers to use which kind of fertilizer, how to actually kind of do the promotion of organic fertilizers there. The same organic fertilizers which we are also promoting under the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture and your Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana. Then the PM Krishi Sinchai Yojana has a major component where we are actually trying to recharge the groundwater table through the rainwater harvesting, and also try to put impetus upon the organic fertilizer uses by the farmers. Then the Food and Agriculture Organization has actually kind of working with the Indian farmers and trying to devise a kind of a forecasting tools for the use of fertilizers in comparison to the various climate changes which are taking place, and for that purpose the integration of Krishi Vigyan Kendra can be done as well. But what is the ideal way forward to improve the soil health? The article today suggests that first of all shall be deregulating the fertilizer sector from the price control. So there shall be automatic registration of any new product which is coming, for example the liquid nano urea which was launched by IFFCO. The farmers may be given the equivalent direct income transfer in the form of digital coupons actually to buy the fertilizers. So the requirement of subsidy can be brought down. There can also be use of water soluble fertilizers which has higher nutrient uptake up to 65 to 70%. Then we need to promote the use of micronutrients to give the best results in the term of productivity. For that we can actually use the kind of regenerative agriculture and various agroforestry methods. Then the article suggests today that there shall be triangulating data on the fertilizer sales, soil health cards, PM Kisan, land records, bank accounts and mobile numbers. All of this shall be compacted and created on kind of a national portal, thus providing all kind of weather informations and various fertilizer based informations to the farmers. Remember the suggestions? Just try to attempt this particular question. We move forward to the next news, where we'll try to understand about the insolvency procedure under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016 and also learn about the National Company Law Tribunal. Let's first start by understanding the terms. What do we mean by insolvency? So let's say for example, I come to you as a bank. You are a bank named Good Students, thus we will denote you from now by GS. So you are a GS bank. I took a loan from you to start a company. Now I have become unable to pay any interest or the principal amount for the next 90 days or 3 months. So I have not paid my loan amount for 90 days. Now that means that I have become a kind of an insolvent. But what if I come to you and I say that the company which I had started by taking the loan from you, that company is completely finished now, and now I am unable to pay either the principal amount or the interest which you were charging anymore, then I have basically become a kind of a bankrupt. So that is basically the incapability of paying dues, and thus will now need to start what? A corporate insolvency resolution process, where you will basically liquidate my assets to recover the amount which you can. To deal with this kind of increasing insolvency issues, the government came up with Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016, under which the National Company Law Tribunal was created. which actually provides insolvency resolution process for both individual as well as companies. The companies which are actually defined under the Companies Act of 2013, and all this procedure is actually regulated by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Remember that earlier, to start such an insolvency procedure, the amount was set as low as 1 lakh rupees, but now that has been increased to rupees 1 crore. Now, what is this corporate insolvency resolution process and how does it function? So basically here, the National Company Law Tribunal act as a kind of an adjudicating authority, which, let's say for example, I go to NCLT and I file an application, or you file an application as GS that I have kind of defaulted on your loan. Now there is 14 days for National Company Law Tribunal to actually approve or disapprove the case. Let's say for example, it approves it. So after the approval, now it will first identify the types of creditor. The types of creditor being the financial creditor and the operational creditor. So I came to you as a bank, you as a GS or good student bank gave me the loan. So you are what? A financial creditor because you provided me with the asset. Now let's say as a company, I opened a kind of an airline company, the company called as Queenfisher. Under the Queenfisher, I employed home the pilots, the air hostess, etc. But now the company has become what? The bankrupt, so I am unable to pay their salaries to them. They have become what in this case? The operational creditors. There exists a kind of a waterfall mechanism where the priority of whatever the amount which we are deriving from the liquidation of assets is first given to financial creditors and then it goes to the operational creditors. So now when we have understood this functioning of CIRP, let's try to understand that what is the role of insolvency professional first. So this insolvency professional is a person or a kind of a company or a kind of an organization which has actually all the information or an expertise related to any kind of haircut if it is provided, or how this resolution process will actually work, how the maximum liquidation of assets can be derived. This insolvency professional is actually registered under the insolvency professional agencies and takes the help of any kind of legal information through the information utilities. Remember, this A, B and C, all of them are regulated by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Now this insolvency professional will create what? A creditor committee. If in this creditor committee both financial and operational creditor will be sitting. In this, if let's say 66% of the people says that yes, the kind of liquidation plan which has been actually proposed to us by the insolvency professional is good, we'll go with that, then we do that liquidation. Or for example, if 33% says that no, such resolution process will not work, then ultimately we do not have any option either to take haircut or the complete liquidation of assets will take place. Just a quick information about the NCLT, which act as a kind of a quasi-judicial authority. It is established under the Companies Act 2013 and it governs the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016, where it deals with the corporate dispute of civil nature. Now we are going to refer to the kind of a data bank which has been provided for NCLT in today's article, where it provides us information such as, for example, how back in 2019, 100 such kind of companies which were having debt of around 8.44 lakh crore were taken for under the CIRP process. Of this, nearly half, that is 4.02 lakh crore, was declared non-performing assets or bad loans by March 2019. A total of 28 companies only went for the liquidation, which had a total debt of 1.23 lakh crore. So when we are saying liquidation, you guys might be thinking, okay, out of this 1.23 lakh crore, at least 50,000 crore would have been derived, but the total amount which has been realized is only 3.17%. Just look here, the total companies in NCLT 82, admitted in IBC 74, total resolved or liquidated stand at 61, resolved is 33, liquidated is 28, total acquisition which has taken place so far is only 7. So the total admitted amount was 2.25 lakh crore out of these companies for which resolution plan was actually accepted, and the realized amount is only 36% of the total claim. And the total haircut which was taken was around 1.42 lakh crore. What is haircut? Which basically means that, let's say for example, I took a loan from you of 100 rupees, but now I have become bankrupt. So when you come and you see my assets which I am holding, that maybe let's say one cycle and one scooty. So you say that, okay, after selling this, how much amount we can recover? That is 60 rupees. So you gave me 100, you are settling down for 60 rupees, you are taking a haircut of how much? 40 rupees. Average days of resolution, you guys can note down, was 960 days, and average days for initiating liquidation itself was 690 days. That kind of reflects at the cumbersome process. The IM report also suggests that how for the financial creditors, the highest recovery rate was observed in the hotels and restaurants and construction industry, and the lowest was for actually electricity, gas and water supply industry. So just keep this information in your mind. You guys can also use this in your mains answers as well, all these data, and we move forward to the next news, where we are actually going to read a very interesting article today which actually talked about the kind of frictional unemployment which is existing in our country, where it states that how the Economic Survey 23-24 estimated that India needs to create 78.5 lakh new jobs in the non-farm sector annually until 2030 to actually meet the demands of the rising workforce. But at the same time, for this, the article put impetus that how we need to close the growing gap between the skill set of the job seekers and the skill requirements of the industry, and that is basically what the frictional unemployment, where basically I am actually ready to work but I do not possess the actual skill which is required by the company. So I am going to the company with my resume every day, the company is rejecting me every day. That is also reflected in the India Skills Report of 2024, which actually suggests that there exists a 60 to 70% skill gap in the machine learning engineer, data scientist, data architect, etc. So basically, when it is coming to the need of the industry 4.0, are we there? Absolutely not. It also suggests that how the overall young employability, so let's say there is 100 youth which are actually kind of graduating from the colleges, only 51 of them actually have the employability skill as per the need of the industry. Then there is complete lack of artificial integration in the learning of these students, and artificial intelligence which is actually kind of taking over the various sectors of the economy today. Its implications, its uses can actually be seen in various sectors of the economy, and if you are unaware of that, also because of the kind of technical divide which exists in our country, the digital divide which exists, that is also hampering our youth's prospects. Then there is issue of brain drain. So there are certain people who are actually coming from prestigious universities which can actually lead to various kind of India solution based kind of innovations, but these good brains of our country is being drained by what? By the companies of the foreign. Thus, what we see in our country is the rising unemployment rate. Just look the unemployment rate in the various states, right? Just which is highest in Lakshadweep and actually lowest in your Tripura. And also the share of unemployed educated youth in the total unemployed person. So for example, of a graduate, the unemployed rate which existed in 2000 was 24.5. So out of 100, 24 graduate people were not getting the job. Now 20 years down the line, 2 decades down the line, it has actually increased to 28%. If we look at the youth unemployment rate by the social group and the level of education, just look the kind of unemployment rate which exists for the graduate and above. That is still close to, let's say for example, for ST it is 33%, for SC it is 35%, for OBC 28%, and for general category around 26%, so much higher in ST SC category as well. Because of these kind of issues, what are the challenges which we face in our country when it comes to the skilling of our demographic dividend? First, let's look at some data. The Periodic Labour Force Survey actually identified that only 20% of the Indian youth aged between 15 to 29 years, the most formative phase of their career, they have received any kind of vocational or technical training through formal and informal sources. Then if you look at the share of youth which has actually received the formal vocational technical training, it was only 4.4% in 2022-23. Again, as we were discussing, 51% of the Indian graduates were, because of this low level of training, were actually employable in the industries. So what is the reason for such low level of skilling which exists in our country? The first is the lack of educational infrastructure. So for example, when the government is launching the Pradhan Mantri National Anusandhan Research Foundation, where it is trying to promote the research or the scientific research in the state universities, the major idea is that in the rural hinterlands, there is not dearth of talent, but the dearth of resources. A lot of people who are studying in the kind of tier 2 or tier 3 cities colleges, they are not being trained with the demands of industry 4.0 or the vocational training. The second is the insufficient training capacity which we had when it came to the skilling initiatives. For example, under the Skill India mission, it was actually targeted that we are going to skill 300 million people by the year of 2022. Can any one of you guess what was the actual percentage which was realized? It was only 15% of this by the year of 2022. What was the reason? The poor allocation of funds, the poor training infrastructure which we have in our country. The third is the lack of entrepreneurship skill. So under, for example, your Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, the idea was that the majority of the youth will actually take up the entrepreneurship route and will start opening their own enterprises by using the skills which they have inculcated. But only 24% of the youth actually opened their own enterprises, and only approximately 10,000 of them actually applied for Mudra loans. Then there is a kind of a high internet and gender divide which persists in our country, where still almost 45% of the rural population is not have the access to smartphones. The percentage is much higher when it comes to actually the rural women in our country. Then there is low industry interface which exists. So for example, the today's article highlights that how almost 66% of the industry is completely going to transition to a digital based format by the year of 2030. But is this requirement of the industries, this transitioning phase, is also being reflected in our universities and the colleges? Thus, the Niti Aayog suggests that how the Indian micro small workforce lacks the digital skill which is required for Industry 4.0. So what has been the government's response? What are the steps which we have taken? First of all, we have launched a kind of a new skilling initiative under the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0. Then under the 2024 budget, the Pradhan Mantri, there was a package for employment and skilling specifically, where we are trying to skill the people with the various kind of vocational training. This idea of integrating the vocational training along with the education from your school level is also actually suggested under the National Education Policy 2020. Then there is a Samarth Udyog Bharat 4.0 initiative which has been taken, where we are actually trying to skill the workers in the MSME industries first. Try to use the kind of traditional knowledge which we have, let's say for example the handicraft worker, and trying to integrate that with the modern technology tools which we have. Then there is a National Apprentice Promotion Scheme, where the government actually provides a kind of a subsidy to provide a kind of an apprenticeship to the person who is actually going under the training phase altogether. Then there is a Sankalp initiative which has been taken by the Ministry of Skill Development and the World Bank to actually train the rural workforce, to actually train the kind of, let's say, tribal people or who are coming from the kind of discriminated backgrounds. So these are the steps which we have taken, but what can be the ideal way forward? So the today's article provides a kind of an innovative suggestion. It suggests that we shall have a simulation-based learning and training modules, where we are actually going to use virtual environments which actually mimic the real world scenarios and thus allow the learners to practice and apply skills in a safe and controlled setting. So for example, let's say if you are a civil engineer, all the construction which you actually learn is in your classroom, where there is no construction which is taking place. So all you are learning is basically a rote learning of formulas, and when you actually go into the field, you are unable to apply that. So that is why there can be a simulation based learning and training module, just like the developed countries of Singapore and Germany. Then such also kind of modules will avail us the instant feedback mechanism to help the trainees to understand their progress and areas of improvement. We can also introduce a kind of a competitiveness among them through the leaderboards and challenges. Now the article suggests that these methods can be implemented under the current schemes itself, the first one being the Swayam platform, which actually hosts more than 4,000 courses. So since its inception, over 40 million participants have already involved in the platform, and a 93% of successful course completions has been achieved. Then we can also do the very same with the Skill India Digital Hub mission as well. So just note down all these innovative ideas and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to actually talk about the idea of the increasing GDP growth of our country and what impact it has on the greenhouse gas emissions which we have. So the article today suggests that the higher economic growth is actually come to believe with increasing environmental pressure, notably through the higher greenhouse gas emissions. However, the India's Economic Survey 23-24 actually claims that India has decoupled its economic growth from the greenhouse gas emission, as between 2005 and 9 our GDP grew by what? A compound annual growth rate of 7%, but the emission rate which we have, the greenhouse gas emission, even though we are currently the third largest country when it comes to the greenhouse gas emission, the emission rate only rose by 4%. So our compounded annual growth rate is much higher in comparison to our emission rate of greenhouse gas. So that means we have decoupled our economy. What does this decoupling actually mean? It basically means breaking the link between economic growth and environmental degradation. Now there are two kinds of decoupling. First is absolute decoupling. In absolute decoupling, it basically means that the countries grow economically at the same time the greenhouse gas emission actually decline. That is not the case with our country. We are actually in the phase of relative decoupling, where both GDP and emission has grown, but the rate of GDP growth, that is let's say 7% at CAGR, is higher than the rate of emission, that is 4% increase. So see, we can understand this by the process of Kuznets curve as well. It basically suggests that, let's say, when the economy starts growing, so there is a kind of a pre-industrial phase, where with the increasing GDP growth, the level of environment degradation will obviously be high, right? So because we actually need a lot of, let's say we are using a lot of fossil fuels to actually power our industries and this production. So with the increasing production, there is also increasing greenhouse gas emission. But over a period of time, we will actually lead to a kind of a phase where we have developed, and at the same time, we have also kind of deployed a lot of green technologies. So we actually start looking towards what? Net zero emission, how we are envisaging by 2070 under our Panchamrit target. So after that, what will happen? That even though the economy will keep on going, the GDP per capita growth, the level of environment degradation will eventually come down. That is the idea which the government of India is also envisaging. What is our claim? Our claim which we have made in economic survey, let's try to assess that. Even though the survey does not specify whether we represent the absolute or relative decoupling, but since the 1990s, with significant trade liberalization, India has been experiencing steady and stable economic growth. So there has been no absolute decoupling, as we can see with the rise of GHG emission. The GDP in India has grown at a much higher pace than the greenhouse gas emission in the country, and thus we are witnessing what? Relative decoupling. The article suggests that such efforts shall continue. So to actually achieve the Panchamrit target which we have set for ourselves, to become a net zero country by 2070, to actually reduce down the total projected carbon emission by 1 billion tons, or to reduce the carbon intensity by 45% by 2030 and increase our non-fossil energy capacity to 500 gigawatt by the year of 2030. The government is actually taking various steps towards that, such as, for example, the solarization of agriculture pumps under Pradhan Mantri Kusum Yojana, or installation of solar rooftop panels under Pradhan Mantri Surya Ghar Yojana, or creation of advanced chemistry cells, and the faster adoption of electric vehicles to actually promote the electric vehicles to curb down the greenhouse gas emission. Shifting to BS6 fuel is also one of that. Promotion of odd and even scheme in Delhi can also be taken. Then there is a national green hydrogen mission, where we are actually trying to produce green hydrogen. Can any one of you tell me in the comment box what is the target which we have set? How much million metric ton of production by the year of 2030? Anyone? Then we can also adopt Miyawaki method and the Nagar Van Yojana for the urban afforestation and bring behavioral changes among us to actually reduce or use less amount of carbon intensive products under the mission life as well. So remember the initiatives, remember the concept of decoupling. We move forward to the next news, where we are actually going to understand a very interesting concept, and that is called as the concept of mule bank accounts. Why? Because the Reserve Bank of India actually created an artificial intelligence powered model to help the banks deal with this rising issue of mule bank accounts to actually reduce the digital frauds. What is this AI model created by Reserve Bank of India? Is called mulehunter.ai. So just note this down. Now let's try to understand what do we mean by this mule account first of all, right? So let's say, for example, the mule bank accounts are typically bought over the fraudsters from the original users. So let's say, for example, I am a poor person. Again, I don't need to say it. You don't have to imagine. I am. So the idea is what? I'm a poor person, I have a bank account. In that bank account, I have got a huge amount of 0 rupees. So what happens? A person comes to me. He says that I am going to use your bank account to do certain transactions, and in the return of that, I will be paying you, let's say, some commission. I'll be like, okay, I am at least going to get the food by the end of the night. Please do that. Now my bank account is actually being used for the illegal transactions. Let's say, for example, for supply of some drugs or something, and I am completely unaware of that. This is the concept of mule bank accounts. So here, often these people who are coming, they are coming from the lower income groups, or they do not have technical literacy. Money mule is basically a term which is used to describe this innocent victim who are duped by the fraudsters into laundering stolen or illegal money via their bank accounts. And when such incidents are actually reported, the money mule becomes the target of the police investigation and not the real person who was actually responsible for it. Then there are various types of money mules which exist. First is the complicit money mules, which is basically a kind of a purposely open money mules connected to the various criminal networks and open bank accounts to receive such illegal funding. Second is unwitting money mules who are actually unaware. So for example, I sent you a link in your email, you opened it, the link said 10 innovative ways to clear the UPSC prelims examination by studying only 10 hours. You'll obviously click on that. Everyone looks for shortcuts. Then what will happen? You will be recruited by, let's say, some romance scam, investment scam, lottery scam, or fake job offers. You will click on that. Now your bank account detail has been compromised, and that is being used for illegal transfer. And then the witting money mules, which is basically a kind of a poor person who actually agrees to be the part of such illegal activity in the return of some commission. Now this is this a serious concern in our country? Yes, absolutely. In 2023, the center actually frozen around 4.5 lakh such bank accounts, typically used for laundering proceeds of cyber crimes. Just look at the 4.5 lakh accounts. Around 40,000 mule bank accounts were detected in the branches of SBI, 10,000 in Punjab National Bank, and so on. So what are the steps which has been taken by the Reserve Bank of India? So there was a kind of a consortium which was organized by RBI, our International Cyber Crime Coordination Center, the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, and various kind of private and public banks. So there was discussion that how the bank shall leverage cutting edge tools such as, for example, artificial intelligence and machine learning. There shall be inter-bank collaboration. There can be use of artificial intelligence for real-time detection. Then there was also a suggestion that, let's say, for example, there is a dormant account from which the money has not been withdrawn from a very long period of time. So there shall be restriction on withdrawal amounts from such dormant accounts as well. And ultimately, there shall be training and upskilling of bank staff as well. So remember the mule accounts. It can be asked in prelims. Remember these kind of suggestions which you can incorporate in your mains answer, and we move forward to the last news of the day, where we are going to actually discuss about a very interesting species which has featured in the news, and that is Indian star tortoise. The Indian star tortoise, which is actually endemic to the Indian subcontinent, note this down, and that is why it is naturally found in our country, a kind of a PYQ. So Indian star tortoise reside in the arid pockets of northwest India, so that is bordering Pakistan, South India, and Sri Lanka. Basically found in the areas of scrub forest, open grasslands, and rocky outcroppings. However, because of their increasing use as a pet, as per IUCN, 90% of the trade actually takes place because of that reason. It is also being found in the far fields of Canada and US as well. Why? Demand of them as pet has entangled them in one of the largest global wildlife trafficking networks. That is why they have been kept in the IUCN list as vulnerable, and in 2019 they were actually shifted to the highest priority list of Appendix 1 of CITES as well, that is Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And in WPA 1972 they are listed in the Schedule 1 as well, which provide basically the highest level of protection to the animals under the Indian law. So remember all these details and ask yourself a very interesting question: why this Indian star tortoise is so easy to smuggle? I am giving you one reason. They can actually remain without food for a longer period of time. Just have a little bit of search on that. You will find some very interesting informations to read. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation, and thank you.